Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. I'm speaking with Aleks Svetski. Hey, Alex, how are you?
Jake, good man. Thanks for having me on.
No, absolute pleasure. I'm so glad you managed to join. So, to kick things off, can you give us a brief introduction to what you're up to today and the projects you're involved in? And what we'll do is we'll cycle back and work out how you got to here.
Yeah, well, okay. The probably the two or three primary things I'm doing at the moment is my podcast actually, so which is
Mm-hmm.
known as the Wake Up Podcast. Looking at potentially changing that name so we can go in there, we can go and explore that as a topic during the pod here. The Bitcoin Times is a publication that I started a couple of years ago. It's kind of a hobby that came out of a talk that I was supposed to give in 2018, 2019. And it kind of ended up being the place where people like Breedlove and GG and all that sort of stuff kind of got known from. So it's something that I'm gonna start to professionalize this year. And other than that, I do a bunch of writing for Bitcoin Magazine and for Zero Hedge and things like that. I also founded a company called Amber, but I'm no longer involved there directly anymore because I've decided to kind of take a step back and get out of the racket, so to speak.
Okay, awesome. Um, yeah, I mean, I've used Amber here in Australia, and I've got friends that use Amber, so I'll ask some questions about that for sure. But
Sure.
yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you for introducing yourself. So you weren't always into Bitcoin, and it wasn't always such a big part of your life. So
Hmm.
um, teach me a bit about what home was like, perhaps, or the journey you went through. Was technology always part of your teenage years, or and we'll get to when you came across Bitcoin and the friend that you probably have that you're incredibly grateful to for telling you about it.
Yeah. No, technology wasn't really a big part of my life. So I think a lot of Bitcoiners sort of had a gaming background or something like that. And I had a really strict immigrant sort of father who was against all of that stuff. In his mind, playing video games and stuff like that was the devil. So we never got to do that. Like me and my brother would kind of beg to go over a friend's place and say that we were going to play soccer, and then we'd kind of go to this friend's place and play a bit of video games and stuff like that. So tech wasn't a real big part of my teenage upbringing. I think my dad finally relented. Originally, my mum relented, and they had a really ugly split kind of in my early teens, and spent I spent some time with my mum, and that's when she got the first computer. Those big ass CRT screens or whatever the hell they were. The big fat ugly monitors, and I remember like, there was like, 133 megahertz, processor. Like fucking can't run anything on it. But those were the days. So like they did finally relent, and that was kind of like the Napster days, and me and my brother fucked around on Napster and stuff like that. I think LimeWire came out after a little while, but I think by the time the torrents came around, like I don't know, I think computers kind of became more ubiquitous, and I never really fell down the computers rabbit hole after that. Like I was more interested in philosophy and philosophy of the mind and philosophy of the body. So and being entrepreneurial. So and most of the businesses that I was involved in the early days were building something, constructing something, putting something together. So I owned a gym at a particular point in time. I had a what else did I have? Fucking I was in the solar industry, hospitality, all sorts of stuff like that. So it was very, you know, tech kind of, I had that little relationship with it early on, and then it came back into my life probably in my mid to mid to sort of second third of my 20s where I got into the software space.
And that, I'm going to guess, was your entrepreneurial journey that took you into the software space. Uh,
Yeah, so I mean, I'd been an entrepreneur, so I dropped out of uni to go and start businesses. So I've never had a job in my life. I've never had a paycheck, so I don't know what that feels like. So I've been entrepreneurial from day one, basically. And yeah, what brought me into the tech space was the attempt to try and solve a problem for payroll. So I was running a hospitality joint at the time. It was kind of like a smoothie health bar and all that sort of stuff. And one of the pains in the ass was running payroll every week. I was like, fuck, I hate this. Like, trying to manage the people's hours, the roster, and figure out what to pay them, and then running it through Zero and figuring out the taxes and all that crap. So we kind of tried to build a solution at least, that took care of a lot of that stuff, automated it, and automated the payment through your bank. And then basically an employer would just get a single button to click once a week to approve the pays. That was it. It wasn't super revolutionary. And yeah, that was kind of like my first foray into tech. And I mean, it was a fucking nightmare, I must admit. Like, it was like building that and dealing with a bunch of devs, and the learning curve of like, when you're building a more tangible business, like you have direct feedback, right? You do something and something happens. Like, you install a new frozen yogurt machine, and all of a sudden people buy a fucking frozen yogurt, and you see your numbers go up. Like, so something changes and it's tangible and the feedback's immediate. Building software often than not is like, you've got to build a whole bunch of shit that you can't see, and you've got to kind of hope that it all dovetails in and comes together. And it's got to then actually deliver on what you envisioned, but it doesn't. So then you need to fix something, but you don't really know what the problem is. So I've got a friend of mine who's a dev, and he kind of says that coding is the process of banging your head against the wall until the wall cracks and you get through. And yeah, like you don't understand that the first time you kind of come into the software space. And I was quite naive getting into the first time, and I mean that it's been almost a decade now, so it's been a while. But you learn a new method of running a business, and that's why I always laugh when I see people who've come from other business or from other industries, and they come into tech and they're like, oh, a couple of university kids built a Facebook. I'm
Yeah.
sure it's something I can do, and it's like, and they fucking fail miserably because it's not within their like,
Skill
it's
set.
not within their mental model. Yeah, like they don't perceive the agile process and this process of like bringing ephemeral components together. So anyway, yeah, bit of a
So
tangent, but
what? No, it's great. I love it. Um, big part of entrepreneurship, keep on swinging. If you
mm-hmm,
if you if you fail, and this has happened to me, I've had businesses that didn't work, and still trying to set things up, and I've got to keep on swinging, right? If you get hit down and it doesn't work out, and you stay down, well, then what's the fucking point of being alive?
mm-hmm.
But saying that, dragging yourself up from failure is really hard. So what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned from those projects that you're involved in prior to today? Or any spectacular, funny memories, stupid things that happened? Often the things that spring to mind are the biggest lessons that we learn.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I couldn't even count them. Fucking, basically, I've made every mistake in the book, from cash flow problems to hiring the wrong way. Like, people are incredibly important in a business. To raising money from the wrong kind of people, to having, one of the early tech companies that I founded, we ended up with an 8 or 9 person fucking board for a 10-person team. Like, we were so top heavy, it wasn't even funny. And that was a function of like, one of the core investors just having he was out of salesforce.com, and he was a great mentor, like incredible kind of guy, but he wanted to push for organizational structure and like he was big on corporate governance, because he'd come out of that kind of company recently, and we were just too young for that. And it kind of became too top heavy and, got political and all sorts of stuff, and, it turned into a fucking disaster as well. There's been other times when, like, one other big lesson is don't get involved in industries where the government is able to manipulate it or fuck with it. And then more importantly, as an extension to that, is, where a government has the ability to turn you off or on. And that one's really tricky, because these days, as we saw over the last 2 years in particular, governments, overreached and turned everyone's business off, over a fucking flu. So it's, I don't know, that one's a tricky one. And for me, that one's changed the nature of the kind of business that I want to be involved in moving forward. And it's part of why I kind of stepped away from Amber, is that I can't censor myself in the face of injustice and lies and stupidity. Like, I have to say something. And when you're running a business that is dependent upon the permission of the people you're fighting, what it creates a situation where you can't speak freely. And I couldn't do that. So yeah, like there's there's a lot of stuff like that. Like, I was involved in the solar industry, and the government got their fucking hands in that as well, and they distorted all the incentives, and basically all the idiots came, and overnight everyone was a solar panel installer, and they were putting solar panels on the wrong side of the fucking roofs. And it just became this one big shit show of an industry.
It's ridiculous.
Like, basically everything the government touches, they break, right? So like, and so that for me was a big lesson, is like, I mean, a few people get the whole government thing right. Like Tesla and Elon Musk is an example of that. Like, he played them beautifully. Like, he played them like a fucking instrument. None of his businesses would have done anything in the absence of the government. Like, we don't need to fucking go to Mars. We don't need solar panels, and we don't need fucking electric vehicles. They're all fucking useless inventions. But with the apparatus of the state that is, siphoning money out of productive industries on one end, and then subsidizing useless industries on the other, some people, and Musk is a brilliant entrepreneur, he was able to position himself in a way that he pulled, exorbitant amount of money out of that to actually build what are good companies, right? They're good products, they're good companies. Like, everything he does is great, but we don't need to fucking go to Mars, because we have a whole planet with oxygen that is totally backwards in its operation, that we need to fix first before we go and fucking land on any other planet, right? Like, we got to clean our own room before we go anywhere else. So it's like, that's a redundant thing. We don't need fucking electric cars, because normal cars are better, they're more competitive, they're more efficient, and they're better for the environment. So like all this other shit. So anyway, it's a weird world we live in, and if you can take advantage of government stupidity and redistribution of wealth, I'm sure you can be successful. But there is definitely, like, your dependence on that apparatus makes you quite subservient to them and their narratives and whatever they want to do. So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, it's what's the right phrase? I can't think of the right phrase, so I'll move on. But
Faustian bargain.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, like, dancing with the devil. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, Faustian bargain, right? So
yeah,
the bargain he made with the devil was,
yeah,
give me everything, but I own your soul.
Yeah, it's funny, and it makes me think as well, like, all those stock listed CEOs out there who, they make public appearances and they say stuff. What do they actually think? Because they can't say what they actually think. Right?
Totally.
And it's like we're in this just ginormous psyop, like the whole thing. And somehow Bitcoin helps you to start peeling the layers of the onion back in a way that you weren't able to before, which is 100% what brings me to the table and why we're having this conversation. And it's just so interesting, because everyone has been through a different journey to get to today and sees what they see. And I really love understanding how previous experiences shape their view of what the world is like today and what it will be going forward. So on that note, you felt that being involved in a business as an entrepreneur that was in any way subservient or reliant on a government institution of some form was not a space that you wanted to be in. What's the opposite to that? Where do you see the opportunity that you want to focus your energy?
Yeah, that's why for me it's content now. So, I admire people like Jordan Peterson, for example, who he's built his entire business model around him and the truth that he represents. And I mean, his biggest Achilles heel is that, if a lot of his earnings are dependent upon the financial legacy system, that could really screw him over. But like, he could very easily, like, if he got debanked or whatever, he could do his shows, charge in Bitcoin, like, he could get around a whole lot of it, right? And Bitcoin's existence means that content creators for the first time in history can actually speak freely. So, I fully expect to get canceled from, like, I've been debanked, I've been, all sorts of stuff has happened in the last couple of years with me. Um, so I fully expect to be locked out of the financial system at some point. And that's fine, because guess what? I can, keep producing content, and people who find value in that content will and can pay me directly. And that's something that that Bitcoin fundamentally changes. So I don't know what else actually these days, because everything else, the government's basically got their hands in everything else. Like, one could have said that, hey, run a restaurant, right? But these days, like, you can't fucking run a restaurant without being first licensed by the state. Then, they come and regulate you. Then there's stupid, food inspectors and alcohol inspectors, and this asshole inspector and that asshole inspector.
Mask inspectors.
Yeah, all of that stuff, right? So, like, the whole dynamic is kind of flipped on its head. So it's like, I don't know what business exists anymore that you can run without basically begging daddy government to give you his approval. And what kind of a fucking retarded world is that? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't know.
And I'm fascinated by this concept of content creation in an era in which you can get paid directly and no one can switch that off. So what does that mean to you? How does that get you excited? Why does that get you out of bed every day?
I mean, getting me out of bed is another question, but I mean, like, what gets me excited, I guess, about that, or what I find promising in that, is that I mean, content is basically how how cyberspace has managed to monetize itself, but it's done so in an ass backwards way, because payments were never able to be done directly between peers online, right? So the way content has had to manifest is through using advertising to monetize it, because that's effectively, like, cyberspace is the realm of content. And yeah, like, kind of Bitcoin flips that on its head. And if you're interested in something, I mean, it could be as simple as, like, a fucking paying 10 sats to see an article from an author that you like, and 10 sats is meaningless. You send that across. Or, like, the value for value model, which Gigi is a real big proponent of, is like, the closest meat space equivalent of that is busking. You go out, you play some music, people like it, they tip you some money. And there's some quite successful buskers out there. So, it basically makes busking and makes direct content monetization. Bitcoin makes busking and direct content monetization in the realm of cyberspace possible, which undermines the need ass backwards method of monetizing content through advertising. And that's a really profound concept, a really profound idea. And I don't know where that takes us. It's going to be an interesting decade as that evolves.
And just to riff off that slightly, there are journalists out there, for example, or content creators out there that are scared about what they write, or maybe not scared, but they're aware of what they produce, and its route to market and monetization is based on a customer. So the traditional media model of advertising, if you've got a powerful pharmaceutical company or large retail business or whatever, who's paying a broadcasting business or content creation business to advertise alongside their content, if that content isn't in line with their incentives, then they're not going to pay them, right?
Totally.
So you're basically whoring yourself out to the highest bidder to create content on their behalf, which then makes you ask the question, well, hang on, what the hell is everything I'm reading or watching or seeing or listening to? Someone somewhere has paid for it because they wanted someone to know what they're talking about, if that makes sense. And so the incentive model of how we create information is, in a sense, corrupted. And so, yeah, I agree. I don't know where it takes us, but it's a phenomenally interesting development in terms of intelligence, isn't it? Like, you can go out and you can create primary research, just like you and I are talking right now, and you can then publish that, and say, this is what these 20 people say who've all got relative experience based on this original hypothesis. Bang. Oh, it's not going to get deleted off Facebook or shadow banned, or YouTube retracts the video or whatever, because you can get paid for it direct. This is a complete change. I mean, these GoFundMe guys, like, pulling funding because the government says don't, give the truckers who are just exercising their right to say no interest. It's just mad. It's absolutely mad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? And so how do you see, like you mentioned the Bitcoin Times, for example, how do you see that playing into this new tech stack? Like, how, as a media business built within the Bitcoin ecosystem, like what does that look like?
Yeah, I don't see. I've also, I think another thing that I've come to grips with is like, kind of lowered my delusions of grandeur. It's like, I think in my 20s, I wanted to be this billionaire that was running, media, like some sort of empire of some sort. And honestly, like my MO moving forward is quality over quantity. And I think this is another thing that Bitcoin has done for me is I only want to do a single edition of the Bitcoin Times once a year. I'm only going to run it for 21 years. So there's only ever going to be 21 editions. And then I'm going to print 2,100 of each as a collectible that is, it'll be numbered, and people will be able to buy that collectible. But it'll be a once a fucking year thing. I'm not going to look at building an empire out of it. I want quality, not quantity. I don't want the responsibility of building a big media empire and all that sort of shit. I just want something really high signal. So like this year's edition, for example, is going to be the Austrian edition. And I've got Seyfedin, Pierre Richard, Bitstein, Tour de Meester, and I'm just tossing up who's going to be the fifth person for it. And it's just going to be super high fucking signal. And that's it. Like, I don't need to make a shitload of money, because guess what? The collectible is not going to be sold for dollars. It's going to be sold for Bitcoin. And people who want to buy it, they can buy it in Bitcoin. And hey, I get to monetize that content that way. And then off the back of that, we'll do I'll do podcasts with each of the authors, and then my podcast is available on Fountain. So if people want to listen on Fountain, they can tip, they can stream sats, they can boost some sats. Each article, has a QR code at the end of it. So if they enjoyed what they read, they can get the article itself online for free, or they can buy the PDF or whatever. They can tip some sats. So all of it is like, can get monetized directly. And if I really, really, really wanted to take it like to next layer sovereignty, I can just host it at home on my own hard drive. So that way, it's completely independent of Amazon and Google and all that sort of stuff, so that anyone anywhere can download it and just pay me direct for it. So like I can be completely out of it. And, that's easier, I think, for smaller enterprises. Like the larger you get, you start hitting diseconomies of scale, because you're going to need to then be dependent on some sort of server and hosting infrastructure and blah, 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 blah. But I guess, that then kind of depends on, how prone your content is to being censored online. And then that's a whole other discussion, right? But anyway, yeah, that's kind of like, a move towards quality instead of quantity is part of, the other part of the mission for what I'm doing with Bitcoin Times. And I think that's important, because we're just flooded with quantity these days.
Mm. And if you could you talk to me a little bit about this mindset change? So it feels very similar to this high time preference versus low time preference
Really
discussion. And I'd never read about that as an economic metric before until I read the Bitcoin Standard. And I'm like, whoa, this is so much more profound an innovation than I ever realized. And I had been heavily down the sustainability rabbit hole, looking at, how do we survive as a species long term when, we're consuming as much as we are. And a lot of what the environmental movement will teach you is basically more of the same, but more government regulation. And it's like,
totally, yeah.
Does this work? And I'd done some angel investing in some early stage clean tech companies that were potentially are great investments, but they require, they're like flexibility managers in an energy grid, or, they're helping to regenerate protein out of waste food and some cool stuff. But are these businesses going to change the consumption patterns of humanity? No.
Yeah,
And
they're
so it
dealing with
wasn't
the
until I read
symptoms, not the
about,
cause.
yeah, and I was like, wow, this is what's the right way of saying it? it's radical. Like Bitcoin is radical, but it might just work versus all the other shit I'd looked at before. And so what you're describing is very similar trend to what a lot of people seem to have in their lives happen. So perhaps you can just reflect on the mindset you were in your mid-20s, and you were trying to start up all these businesses. You had all these ideas. You were operating in markets you didn't understand properly, making it up as you go along, versus the man you are now and your focus on quality over quantity. What's the difference, do you think? And obviously Bitcoin's played a role in that.
Time preference is central. Time preference is central to everything human beings do, because a time preference is a value judgment. And what we do, we are value judgment machines. That's what human beings do. We every minute of the day, we are making decisions, and a decision is the outcome of a value judgment. We are constantly faced with choices. So the way we make those value judgments is, in large part determined by our time preference. If you have a high time preference, you discount the future significantly in relation to the present, and therefore you approach things more hedonistically or nihilistically. It's like, now who gives a fuck about later? Mañana I'll deal with it, whatever. Versus a low time preference, you kind of like, you send your gaze out further along, and you start thinking about downstream effects. You start thinking about long term, and you're more interested in quality than you are in quantity. You'll buy something once and you want it to last. You don't want to buy something that is cheap, shitty plastic that'll break tomorrow because it's cheap today, right? So your whole orientation starts to shift. And I think, as you said, like, there's all these clean tech companies that are basically dealing with the symptoms of a broken world. And they're all going to be subject to Jevons paradox, right? He talks about, like, as we unlock more energy, we will find ways to consume all of that until we hit the threshold again. And then we have to unlock more energy, and we end up basically consuming all the energy we create. I would argue there's probably a corollary with the clean tech side of things, is like, if we figure out how to turn the junk, in rubbish dumps into usable protein or whatever, what we'll do is we'll actually create more fucking junk,
more rubbish.
So that, exactly. So it's not actually solving the cause of the problem. And the cause of the problem is blind fucking consumerism, people running around buying shit they don't need, gambling, investing, creating fucking needless things because they're in this race against the devaluation of their time and their effort over time. So, like, we're all in this ridiculous rat race, and the solution, like, it's weird. It's metastasized in all sorts of ways. Like, you look at online, you look at everything. Like, everything is just quantity. Everything is fucking meaningless. Like, the amount of hysteria that is, like, engulfed the world. Like, I don't want it anymore. Like, and so for me, the big thing has been this shift to quality over quantity, which is a function of my time preference having been lowered. Is that, Bitcoin allows me to save the product of my labor across time, more importantly than just space. And therefore, I can do something, I can add my piece of value, and I don't need to chase the next big fucking win, because, at least, I mean, I still want to do something significant in the world, but I can do it on my clock and on my terms. I don't have to do it, trying to opportunistically squeeze myself into a little, window that the government enables to be open, due to oversight or due to, regulatory capture or something like that. So I don't know, it changes things fundamentally for me. And yeah, I think, Bitcoin's at the center of all this stuff. That's important.
Well, and if I could flesh out your point there around consumerism, I'd almost truly, like, the point is the money we're using is disintegrating, like, around us, and that is actually what creates the consumerism that we see.
Absolutely.
So consumerism is the symptom in this case, and
Totally.
the core problem is this inflationary money that we're having to use, and it just disappears, right? And you go, oh fuck, I've got $100 today. Well, I might as well buy that pair of trainers before 12 months from now when I can actually only buy, one of them. you got one shoe on rather than two. It's like, well, of course, everyone's short term in terms of their thinking. And it was a really awesome moment when I first started learning about it, because you think, oh wow. And then it starts to change things. You actually have more optimism in your life, and you look forwards and you go, okay, now I can start to make plans for the future. What I'd love to understand a bit more, Aleks, is, so in terms of writing, I've read some of your articles. I've really enjoyed them. They've been, to say the least, counterculture to what I have grown up with, going to, a UK school, going to then a university in the UK, being pummeled with Keynesianism, and then, chucking myself into brokering and being in the rat race in a central urban area, and money, work, and then diving into startups, take more risk, you need a bigger win, it's not working, and then whoa, I'm absolutely fucked after 10 years of hammering it out. But what's amazing is how your mind changes, and I love writing, and writing helps you to understand topics better, and if you can't write it, well, then you don't understand it. So talk to me a bit about your passion for writing, because it comes through, and your ability to take on subjects that are like, oh, you can't say that. Do you know what I mean? Like it's something that you clearly really enjoy doing. And just explain to me how that journey's played out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've a couple months ago, actually, I was going through my old computer, and I found some like early notes that I wrote from, man, like 2006. And I was a punk ass kid, like 19, 20 years old. And I read some of it. I was like, shit, man, this is like pretty wise stuff for a 19-year-old kid. Like, and I guess I was always like interested in philosophy and stuff like that. And at that time, I guess, I can look back and say now that I was, cerebrally understanding stuff. Like, so I read a lot of Bruce Lee and like Eastern philosophy and all this sort of stuff. And, there was some really interesting stuff. Like if you look at, 20-year-old Aleks versus, mid-30s Aleks now, like the difference in writing is obviously a clear difference. I was much more Zen than I, back then than I was now. But I actually forgot that I've been writing for a long time. And it was all private stuff. I was just writing on my own. I remember like I went on this road trip by myself, like a loner, when I was 20 years old. And I drove from Sydney to Brisbane. And I spent a bunch of time up in the mountains. And it's funny, I totally forgot about that until I found these old notes. And I was like, holy shit, I remember when I wrote that. I was in this like, up in Tambourine Mountains, hanging out. I was doing a fast, and I, had some inspiration, and I was writing about whatever I was writing about, philosophy and fluidity, and, being able to, adjust your orientations with the, whatever the fuck it was. I can't remember now. Like it's been a couple months since I read through the stuff, but so I think I've always been writing, and me and John Vallis did a podcast recently where we spoke about actually this process of writing. He wrote that Money Messiah piece, which was fantastic. And he started writing that piece about a year and a half ago when I was originally writing some Jordan Peterson things. And he told me, he's like, oh man, I'm writing something similar. I was like, fuck yes, let's all, let's try and bring Jordan Peterson into the fray, which, obviously we've ended up doing in some way, shape, or form. But he and I spoke about writing, and it's kind of, like you said, it's a structuring of thoughts, because like we all think a whole lot of stuff, but the process of writing takes it from the chaos of the mind, like the chaos of the subconscious void, and it puts it into the order of the conscious. And that's a meaningful process. And I think the more I've done it, like when I sit down to write, sometimes I don't know what the fuck I'm going to write about, and something starts to flow. And in fact, my best pieces honestly have been complete like rants that have come out of nowhere. I've woken up at 2 o'clock in the fucking morning angry about something, and I've just like ranted, or I've been told by some masked Nazi to fucking wear a mask, and I go and rant. So it's interesting how thinking, the subconscious void, emotion, writing, they're all sort of interrelated, and writing is like not only a cathartic process and a an ordering of ideas process, but it's also like a sharpening of perspective and a sharpening of all sorts of stuff. So yeah, I find it a very interesting thing that I think more people should consider doing if they find that same sort of I guess drive within it.
It's like inspiration comes from strange places, and sometimes you just have to
Mm.
scratch an itch, and it can be 2 o'clock in the morning, and you wake up and you're like stewing away about whatever it is, and whether it's just to like write a plan or write some notes or just anything. And I found that in myself. You feel more relaxed as a result. So Aleks, I'm intrigued. You mentioned so obviously you grew up in Australia, but you're not here any longer. I'm from the UK, but now living in Australia. My wife's Aussie.
Mhm.
So you had migrant parents. So where was home from them originally, and what was it like growing up in Australia?
They were Macedonian, so Eastern European. I think they left, kind of in the aftermath of like, the communist collapse of Yugoslavia or whatever the fuck it was at that time. I'm not too familiar with it. And yeah, there was a bunch of like Balkan migrants that came to Australia in the 60s and 70s, right? And my dad in particular was one of those. They sort of came like, the three countries primarily they came from was like Macedonia, Greece, and Italy, right? There was also obviously Bulgarians, Serbians, Croatians, and all that sort of stuff. They kind of all migrated to eastern US, to Melbourne, to Sydney, and to probably parts of the UK and Canada. Um, and yeah, I mean, I grew up. They were a working class family. They started with nothing, and built up from scratch. I guess that's where I got a little bit of my traditional values from. My, by no means like was it a. I guess in some sense it was a good childhood because we were born in probably what I'd consider one of the more golden ages of Australia, like the 80s, 90s, where Australia was still innocent. I don't think Australia's innocent anymore. I think Australia's really fucked itself up and it's going to get worse. But, the 80s and 90s were a good period in Australia. It was, it was prosperous. It was very free, liberal in the classical sense, not in the retarded sense that we have today. And yeah, I mean, but I grew up to a very, very tough father, and a hardworking mum who, their marriage completely fucking fell apart. And my dad was super violent and all that sort of stuff, but like that's just sort of the culture that he, kind of came from. So yeah, I mean, grew up, went to school. I was super academically strong, but I was always getting in trouble, because it's what you do when you're a fucking boy and you're a kid, so
Don't do that. What do you
yeah.
mean? Do it straight away.
Yeah, exactly.
And sorry, so which part of Oz were you did you grow up in?
Sydney. So I was kind of like
In
western
Sydney.
suburbs of Sydney. So
Okay.
Liverpool, Campbelltown, the ghetto.
I mean, I have to confess, I don't know much about Australia, so I often have to go straight to Google Maps and have a look because I've only been here for a couple of years. But I'm intrigued by what your take on the state of Australia is at the moment. So, what have you witnessed in terms of the change from when you grew up and you no longer live here? So you've decided that it's not the right place for you to physically be. What's that thought process been?
Yeah, Australia is a police state that is unfortunately like it's the most beautiful, visually the most beautiful country on the planet. It has got great people in it by and large, um, but it is a complete uh, nanny state that is that it's an interesting one because it was built by frontiersmen effectively. So like we all know the convicts went down there and all that sort of stuff, but it was genuinely built by frontiersmen, who were strong, rugged, I guess freedom oriented, and it was built on largely Western values, and that I believe is a big part of why Australia had so much success in the early days. And then it also was far enough away from World War One and World War Two that it didn't get bombed and fucked up. So it continued to prosper. And I would argue that Australia is probably, it doesn't have the moonshot kind of richness that America has. But in terms of like the general status quo, Australia is probably the richest country in the world, like as a general sort of rule of thumb. the average standard of living is extraordinarily high, and it's higher, I think, than anywhere else in the world. So it was built on these Western values. It was, originally built by frontiersmen. So it had everything going for it, and it missed out on, like I said, World War One, World War Two, all the communist bullshit and all of that. So it just kept compounding the capital. And what happened over time was the classic, strong men create good times create weak men create bad times. And we're in that part of the cycle with Australia, is that you've got these entitled fucking brats that have grown up in nothing but prosperity. And what they're going to do is they're going to suck the accumulated capital of the last century or two out of the country in the process of attempting to redistribute wealth by decree, by fiat. And they're going to do that through regulation, mandates, fucking ridiculous rules, welfare, money printing, taxation, you fucking name it, they're going to do it. And that's all by virtue of the fact that Australia has so much accumulated capital in reserve to be used up. Now, unfortunately, for Australia, what that means is, and when people used to ask me, it's like, oh, why did Australia go full fucking dictator and somewhere like Mexico didn't? It's because the distance between food and starvation in Mexico is like 3 days, whereas the distance between food and starvation in Australia is probably 3 years of bad policy. So in Mexico, it's very quick for a revolt to happen. So there isn't the accumulated capital doesn't exist in order to play dictator with everyone's fucking lives. And Australia is rich enough and technically sophisticated enough to basically become a digital gulag. And the thing is, it's like they're also innovative enough to make the gulag look and feel safe or welcoming. So you'll walk into your gulag and it'll have pretty pictures and some nice music. So you walk into it with minimal pushback, and that's where I think Australia is really, 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 really fucking dangerous.
As someone who grew up in the UK and Australia was like the Wallabies, who were like this brilliant rugby team that always beat us, or blokes in the pub wearing flip-flops in the middle of winter. It's like, who the fuck are what? You don't go to Australia, but they're like, they're Aussies.
Yeah.
And then here I am, living in Oz and moved here so recently. Melbourne was an extraordinary experience the last 24 months. Like, and you use the phrase police state. My wife got arrested in the center of the CBD of Melbourne when it was literally just police for as far as you could see. And it was on a Wednesday night. She tried to meet her mum. Now, it's true that she was there because she was not interested in what the government was saying was necessary in order to get out of the COVID issues, i.e., get vaccinated or, you're going to die. It was just, the whole thing was just crazy. It's like, well, hang on, I have autonomy over what goes into my body. So I disagree with your policy. Oh, okay, well, the fact that you disagree with our policy means you've got to sit in your home. You're now locked out of any kind of society that you might want to be part of, i.e. go to the pub because you didn't have a vaccination passport. I mean, the whole thing was just like, how has this happened in such a short space of time? 5 kilometers, you couldn't go further than your front door. You're only allowed outside for an hour. And anyone that was willing to go, I don't agree with what you guys are doing, was like shunned. It split families in half. It split friendships in half. The government embellished this, right? Dob on people is what they were trying to get you to do. And you go, how has this happened? And the thing that I took away from it was how vulnerable I actually was. As like, I've just had a child, got another one on the way. Where's my water coming from? The tap. Where's my food coming from? The shop. Where's my money coming from? My job. But you're not even allowed out of your own home. Like, hang on. And you basically, I felt very vulnerable, and I swore to myself I'd never let that happen again. But given the recent election here, obviously the Labour Party getting in at the federal level, they were making promises like, we're going to help pay for 30% of your house when you buy it, as like a kind of government commitment. It's like, but do people not realize that when the government owns 30% of your house, if they don't like what you think, they're going to just kick you out of your house? And they probably already have that influence over mortgage companies anyway, right? So these big debt businesses that are part of the real estate industry here, that is one of the most manipulated markets I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And you go, whoa, what is happening here? And so, okay, yeah, that's just a bit of my experience. I don't want to bang on about that for too long, but the fact is you've chosen to leave. You've left friends and family behind, and you're living somewhere else in the world. Just talk to me a little bit about that thought process. So you were like, I think my future is best served somewhere else. How come that's the case?
Well, for all the reasons I mentioned, is that you know, I don't want to support with the product of my labor a maniacal society. Like, you know, I take the Ayn Randian approach of just walk away. I would much rather earn nothing. I'd much rather just go to the fucking jungle somewhere and be a societal pariah and fucking outcast and have nothing to do with society, because to me that is more moral than running any form of business or doing anything in a society like that. And Ayn Rand painted this picture in Atlas Shrugged really well. She's like, the what keeps the looters and the moochers going is the productive individual continuing to toil and work, because it gives the looters and the moochers something to extract from. So I forfeit that right. You know, I I would rather honestly, I would rather own nothing and be happy, so long as they can't take anything from me.
Yeah, because then they own nothing either in that
Yeah,
sense.
exactly.
Rather than
So
that
I think,
you'll own nothing and be happy because we own everything and you rent it off
yeah,
us. You know, that's a very
correct,
different
correct.
model. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, yeah, if a lot more people did that, if a critical mass of people did that, like the fucking, and this is why you know, I think Bitcoin's the most important thing in the world today, is that by virtue of moving on to a Bitcoin standard, you can own nothing within their sphere of influence, and be happy. Um, so owning Bitcoin and being happy, but in that sense, for them, it completely rug pulls them, because they subsist, they literally exist off the back of our blood, sweat, and tears, and our labor. And doing that, you know, you exit, and it fucking really screws them over, man. And if a critical enough mass of people do that, I mean, you know, there's obviously complexity around, like, you know, there's physical property, obviously, in Australia, and there's a lot of good physical property. There's good land and all that sort of stuff. But man, you know, if people, you know, earned their money in Bitcoin, stop paying some fucking taxes, you'd quickly see that thing start to fall apart very, very, very fast.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And that was another thing I didn't even mention. As an Australian citizen, during lockdowns, you had to get an official exemption from the government to even leave Australia.
Yeah, yeah,
So
correct. Yeah.
I, as a British passport holder, could have left, but my wife wasn't allowed to. And that's when I went down the kind of jurisdictional arbitrage rabbit hole, which is essentially what you're living out in a sense. And that's fascinating, right? It's nation states need to start competing against each other, because for the first time in history, families can own their assets digitally, take them anywhere they want, and they're not going to get hamstrung by the fact they're leaving behind their cafe of 30 years, or, you know, whatever factory they might have built up over time that was a nice cash cow for the local government. They're like, yeah, we're selling up and we're off. See ya. So what are some of the ramifications, do you think, of this new kind of competition paradigm between nation states and this ability to store wealth elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it eliminates the what do you call it? The nation state paradigm. So Bitcoin is the end of the nation state. They're incompatible ideas. They just don't work. For a nation state to exist, you need scale, and the only way to get scale is to do three things: to inflate the money supply, to coercively tax, or to borrow from the future. Um, Bitcoin makes all of those three concepts impossible. So it basically chops the fucking idea of a nation state off from the beginning. So it's impossible to do. So I think what it does is it moves the world towards localization and basically an organic maxima towards territorial homogeneity. So what I mean is, like, if you want to operate a territory, it will need to be first and foremost operated more like a business, right? So it needs to be operated well, where the people within the territory are more like customers, not like your fucking subjects, which is the way it works with the nation state today. So there's that relationship. It transforms from subject overlord to customer service provider. So that's like the first thing. But I think there is a maximum scale at which that kind of a territorial operation can function profitably, because that'll be the goal, to operate functionally, and functionally means you're operating profitably. That's your scorecard. So I think what will happen is there'll be diseconomies of scale as things get large. So therefore, I think we'll move towards like city states being the kind of the macro version of societies as opposed to nation states. So, all of it kind of comes down to like a question of time, right? Like, we're definitely still in the nation state era, and Bitcoin shatters that completely. How long it takes for things to really fragment, to move from nation state to, like state, like to, Australia's got 7 states, America's got 50, etc. So like, that stuff is going to have to fragment. And then, there'll come a point where that kind of starts to fragment further, and, the cities within the states, start to become, more autonomous and different. And then, like the future prospects of that is like really encouraging, is you get genuinely different, diverse cultures. You get diversity in the organic sense, not diversity in the fucking woke sense, where they try and cram different people together and force them to work together, right? Diversity in the organic sense is that you have all sorts of different cultures emergent in different places from around the world that are all different because they're not under one national fucking banner. And that's interesting. That's something that's been missing in the world for the last 100 years, especially. Like, the idea that you can go to somewhere in the world and it be fundamentally different is kind of foreign now. Like a lot of places have been, to a degree, like, globalized. Like I remember going to Bali like 5-10 years ago, whenever it was, like for the first time, and the busiest place in Bali was fucking McDonald's. I was like, are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? You come out here to go to McDonald's? What is wrong with you people? So like that, like like local culture is being demolished by virtue of this sort of globalizing force. So I think the pendulum swings with Bitcoin, and that is something extraordinarily encouraging, and that is, the sovereign individual thesis, et cetera, talks to that. But yeah, I think that the fabric of society fundamentally shifts and changes, and I'm fucking super excited to see like how that rolls out. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but
no, I welcome it as well. It springs to mind a situation, and talk Melbourne again. So the state premier of Melbourne, this guy called Daniel Andrews, who you will have heard of for sure, but for those listening that aren't in Australia, yeah. He's a fucking psychopath, this bloke. But he basically, one of his buddies had a security company. The security company was hired to run security on one of the hotel quarantines in the center of Melbourne CBD at the start of the pandemic. There was no like official proposal or any kind of like documentation to show why that was the right company and why the cost was correct. And then there was basically an outbreak of COVID from that from that hotel, which managed to get into some old people homes and killed a bunch of people. Now, putting aside the discussion as to whether or not COVID's that dangerous in the first place, the policy at the time was such that the responsibility was on those running that hotel, and they failed at their job. And there was then an inquiry, and it cost $2 million to have a bunch of the leading state Labour Party members in front of a lawyer or a judge. I don't know exactly who the people were interviewing, but they literally said, I cannot recall. It's like, so sorry. So you cannot remember who employed that security company. Literally the whole of this political party just denied that they couldn't even remember. Point that I took away from it was there's zero accountability at the top of this situation we find ourselves in, the hierarchies that run our society. They do not give a fuck about the average person on the street, and they are not accountable to their own policies and own actions. And you think, well, hang on, how is that fair that, you know, you're out working your ass off, paying taxes all day long, you don't even know where your tax goes, couldn't drive anywhere for a year, but I still had to pay my road tax. I mean, just stupid stuff like that happens all the time with these kind of inept governments. And so what you're describing is a future in which there's a far higher level of accountability. And I do love the sovereign individual thesis, the way that it re-emphasizes that contractual obligation between a buyer and a seller, a provider and someone who's a consumer. And this idea that actually there will be more accountability in the future. Like Daniel Andrews was the CEO of a stock listed company. He would have been sacked months and months and months ago. But somehow he hasn't been. I mean, who knows? But it's at least it's very promising and very exciting that we see a future like this, which I get passionate about straight away. So Aleks, so I'm going to start drawing to a close. We've been almost an hour. Someone told you about Bitcoin at some stage for the first time. Talk to me a little bit about like when you first came across it, who that friend was. You probably told them they were a complete idiot and it wouldn't work. Or maybe it was love at first sight. Just a little bit of a backstory on when you first came across it and how it was.
Yeah, I think we all have a couple touch points. I mean, the first time was I was a gold and silver bug in 2011, 2010,
Okay.
2010, 2010, 2011, 2012. And somewhere in that place, I'm pretty sure around 2012, it would have been like I heard about Bitcoin, you know, in the gold silver circles. Can't remember if it was fucking Max Kaiser jumping up and down on a couch or something like that. But, you know, I you know, dismissed it, stuck with my gold and silver, made a bunch of money. Like, you know, it was fine. And it just never crossed my radar again because then, like I said, remember I was not in tech businesses. I was more in like
Yep.
hospitality, this, that. So it was never interesting. And it wasn't until 2015 again, like the person who mentioned it was actually a friend of a friend of a friend of mine. And he was just a degenerate junkie who was buying shit online with this thing called Bitcoin. I was like, fuck, is that thing still around? He's like, yeah, bro, you know, my friend made a bunch of fucking money out of it. He made millions. And I was like, what? What are you
Pretty
talking
high
about?
at the
And
time.
yeah, probably. And then, you know, that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole. And it was that interest for me, like the black market nature of Bitcoin was interesting to me. I was like, fuck, this is interesting. You've got something that people are using that is like circumventing the ability of the state to censor you. And again, I wasn't really like I wasn't Austro-libertarian at that time. I wasn't any of that sort of stuff. Like you know, I've been extraordinarily radicalized since finding Bitcoin, and particularly since 2020. But just something about that interested me. So yeah, I that kind of sent me slowly down the rabbit hole. And the further I got down, you know, the further I careened into this fucking thing that is, you know, basically, you know, encompassed my entire life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's well, it's such an interesting journey. Everyone has such an interesting journey, but on a personal level, it's very enjoyable to kind of see how your brain or your worldview alters over time. And in that process, obviously, you were entrepreneurial. You were setting up all these businesses, and you realized actually you're going to set up a Bitcoin business, which you've done, and obviously now stepped away from. So, you know, the thing that I almost take from that is I used to view entrepreneurship as like the most, or specifically breakout tech kind of get the unicorn type entrepreneurship was like that was the only way to go. And I think maybe you had a similar mindset at one stage, and now actually
Totally.
that's just really not what I want to do. And that is again the influence of Bitcoin. Like you've got a way of saving your life force, and you know that actually that's probably the best bet you can make from an investment perspective anyway, versus all the other startups you could put money into or start your own. And so yeah, it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? Aleks, well, listen, thank you so much for your time. An hour's flown by. Any final comments at all once we close up the conversation?
One thing I didn't mention at the start, which I should mention, is other than the Bitcoin Times and the podcast and everything, I always forget this. I authored a fucking book. Me and
Awesome.
Mark Moss got together and we wrote a book called the Uncommunist Manifesto.
I
And it's
actually did think
basically,
halfway through our chat, I was like, I wonder if Aleks has ever written a book. And I already knew that you had, but I'd forgotten about it. I'm going to have to read it.
yeah. So it's pre-launch at the moment. We did a Kickstarter a couple months ago, and we're about to finish fulfilling the Kickstarter. Once we've done that, then we're going to go on Amazon. So I think we'll be on Amazon probably early July, and then we're going to do a whole roadshow. So we'll be on all sorts of podcasts. But we did like a mini print run. We got it into Jordan Peterson's hands. We got it into Tucker Carlson's hands, JP Sears, and a bunch of people. So I think this book's going to make a splash, man. And it's basically we emulated the format of the original Communist Manifesto. So 4 short chapters, describing and explaining, like, basically we shifted the axis. So, the Communist Manifesto itself, which I recommend everyone read. I apologize in advance for the brain damage it's going to give you by reading it, but like, read it to see how ridiculous the ideas are. But Marx and Engels make the claim, like, there's two primary claims in there. Number one, is that all of history can be distilled into the struggle between two classes, the oppressor and the oppressed. And number two, that communism can be summed up by the abolition of private property, right? So, a functional world is apparently the absence of private property. So Marx was the original, you will own nothing and be happy. And, like I always say, Klaus Schwab is like Karl Marx 2.0. If you want to know what the Great Reset was, communism was the original Great Reset. We're kind of doing version 2 now, in the digital era. So, I encourage people to go back and read that book and then go and pick up a copy of the Uncommunist Manifesto, where, Mark and I basically changed the axis of that struggle. We said, no, it's not, the history of the world is not fucking one oppressor versus the oppressed. The history of humanity is basically the choice between making progress via the collaborative and economic means, or the coercive and political means. So one is the multiplicative means of the free market of trade. So human beings have managed to progress either through trade or through beating someone over the head and taking their shit. That's the only forms of progress, and that's really what the struggle has been. And that struggle has existed at the individual level and at the collective level. So that's the real axis. It's not fucking one group versus another. So we did that, and then we reframed capitalism as this. We said capitalism is not some political modality. It's actually the natural process that all species undergo through evolution. So, like, capitalism is the process of taking chaos and transforming it into something of higher order. We've been doing capitalism since the day we picked up a stone and threw it at a fucking at a animal to, like, make more efficient the process of feeding ourselves. That is capitalism in nature. And the argument that we make in there is that capitalism actually exists in all political modalities across the entire political spectrum. The only difference is, how much does the political modality you operate within suffocate the natural process of capitalism? And if it suffocates it too much, you get total systemic collapse. If it doesn't suffocate it too much, like, so if it's wide enough, then hey, you get the natural force of innovation and progression to take the society forward. So that's like the two sort of big things that we tackle in there. So it's a short book. It's like a hour and a half, 2 hour read maximum, and yeah, it's going to go on Amazon soon. So if anyone wants to kind of be on the list, like, we're going to do, I think, a flash sale when we launch it. I think we'll do 99 cents or something like that for like the first 12 hours. So uncommunist.com, jump on there, pop your name in, and then you'll be notified when the flash sale goes on Amazon, because the Kickstarter is over now. And yeah, that's I think that's going to make a splash, and we hope to change the fucking narrative a little bit, because communism is a really bad narrative, and it's it's the cancer that's taken over the world.
Well, I welcome that. It just strikes me as I have a conversation someone recently who's like, well, communism's never been tried properly. True communism's never existed. When you actually think about it, that probably is the best form of society. And you're like, okay, you're allowed an opinion. That's not a problem. On the flip side of that, like capitalism is kind of demonified. Is that right? I was saying it?
Demonized. Yeah.
Demonized. Thank you. And probably hasn't ever been tried properly either, right? Because there's this constant kind of to and fro between.
Well, it's not that it's been tried. Like capitalism is beyond us trying it in a political framework, because capitalism is just what we do. Like if you go out and you make something and you sell it to someone, you've just performed capitalism. Like, yeah. So it's not something we try or not try. It's just the extent to which we suffocate it with political red tape. That's really the only difference. And that's why America was so fundamentally powerful and got such a massive start in the early days, was that there was no fucking government to get in the way. So what did people do? They went out and they built shit.
Yeah,
and America was exactly. So that's natural. Like that's what we do as human beings. It's when we wrap it in bureaucracy that we fuck it all up. And communism is just peak bureaucracy. So thank God we've never tried pure fucking communism, because we'd all be dead.
Yeah. Or if you were to take the thought process from earlier about the Ayn Rand philosophy of, if I'm the producer and the moochers are just going to take everything that I have, therefore I'm just not going to produce. Well, in peak bureaucracy, like nothing would get done. Correct. There'd be no producers. There would be just nothing. And actually, it strikes me like I went to Cuba, for example, and you'd walk around Havana, and the buildings are falling down, and you're like, what the hell? Like, what the hell's happened here? Some of the, don't get me wrong, happiest and nicest people I've ever met. But equally, like, they weren't even looking after the buildings they were living in. Like, how does that incentive model actually make sense for long-term stability? I don't see how that works, but that's one small microcosm.
Yeah.
Aleks, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. How can people get in touch if they want to reach out?
Yeah, so uncommunist.com. There, my Twitter handle is probably the easiest. So Ghost of Svetski, because I keep getting banned. So that's the latest functional account. And then my link tree, like, there's a whole bunch of clips in there. So linktree.com/Svetski. My name's pretty easy to spell. You'll find all of my stuff there. So that kind of links back to my blog with Bitcoin Magazine, to the Bitcoin Times. It links to the podcast, the book, all sorts of stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk me through your journey, and good luck with all your projects in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, my friend.
No problem.